The Vatican II was, of course, a complete surprise to monks as well as to everybody else, and it represents a truly amazing response to the papal charism that Pope John XXIII, totally on his own initiative, said he was going to have this council. Well, it was not well appreciated by many of the cardinals and bishops because they didn't think it was the right time to have one, and the world was in quite a bit of turmoil. The Cuban crisis had occurred, I believe, in '61, and Pope John was elected in '58. So I saw him where the abbots had a meeting of their own general chapter, and he humbly stopped to see us on his way back from Castel Gandolfo to his fall reckoning, and the council was about to show up. This was 1962. So you'd have to see Pope John, but I don't know whether they have much coverage of him. But he was a kind of Humpty Dumpty, a little over extended in front. But he was sweetness itself, so when he came in the church, as was the custom, he sprinkled a little holy water at the door to improve the spiritual level of the place. And I would say the water barely succeeded in covering, getting beyond the tummy. So he went in and went down the hall and saying hello, greeting the abbots who were gathered there, and then he sat down on his chair and sort of flowed into the chair, and he read a speech probably composed by our abbot general, and then he insisted on meeting everyone who was there personally. And so they came up one by one. He was sitting at the edge of the altar steps there, and he held their hands, and so I held his hand and looked into his eyes, and the abbot general introduced each one. So it was a delightful moment. And then when he finished all the monks, he all the secular help, he wanted to see them too. So he was like a grandfather of the most gracious kind, I would say. And so it really is his spirit, it seems to me, that this present Pope, we finally got a Pope. The others were excellent and did their job, I'm sure, but this Pope seems to have caught the spirit of Pope John, and hence the spirit of the council, which is pastoral and open and trying to put the church in from a defensive position into a collaborative and dialogical situation. Okay, well, I didn't understand the council at all in the first few years. I didn't know what the heck they were doing. And we were somewhat shocked sometimes by some of the documents which we read in our eating hall when they were completed. So it was a very new experience and unsettling, because we didn't know where they were going, and nobody asked for our opinion, and so we just kept doing our thing, which was quite vigorous at the time with all these vocations and people beginning to one of the great things the Vatican did was to give you people permission to question their unquestioned assumptions, one of which for monks was you can never leave. And so some monks had entered probably too early for a final decision, and they needed to be allowed to rethink it, and when they did, they decided they shouldn't stay. But for us, where the final profession, which many of them had made, was so crucial, it was a constant blow after blow, as if someone was hitting you in the face with a wet dish rag or perhaps an axe. It was unbelievable how they were going. So I experienced myself in the early 60s as leading the community to its destruction. Whereas my original idea was we'll try to renew the Christian contemplative tradition. But the monks hadn't heard that idea, and they didn't know what to do with it, and they had their serious concerns, and being young, they were absorbed by the new aspects of the life they were living. So it really wasn't until after Vatican II closed that I began to understand it, because I didn't have time to read all the papers. There was lots of them. I had to run a monastery and try to lead a contemplative life of my own, and there was not enough hours in the day to do that. I had to travel to different foundations. So I would say I first found the council puzzling, confusing, and some of the decisions they were thinking of making almost unthinkable in the context of the previous doctrinal instruction I'd had. It was really after the Vatican Council closed that and he had time to read the documents that it began to dawn on me, at least, of how profound was this Reformation. First of all, the document on the Church's relation to other religions was revolutionary. It was a 180-degree change. Now, of course, you could argue, well, it was this continuity, but that's largely, I think, a mirage. It was, to say that you could have dialogue with not just the Protestants, just to realize how serious that was. In my boyhood, I had a grandma who was a wonderful and faithful Episcopalian lady, and she never thought of converting. And her daughter was my mother, who was a kind of Bible, not unpleasantly so, but a Bible Christian. So I and my grandma had a great relationship. She introduced me to the opera and other cultural norms, and she was especially fond of me. I think she doted on me a little because I had inherited the name of her beloved husband. My real name is not Thomas Keating. My real name is Joseph Parker Curlin. My father's name, Keating, adding on the end. And he was the founder and head of this Admiralty law firm in New York, which was probably the best one in the country, if not the world at the time. And so Grandma was in high society, and she knew the Cravath, the head of the Metropolitan Opera, and they knew and my father, as a lawyer, represented the U.S. lines and the people who ran that company and all that stuff. So I was worrying about Grandma's salvation, because at that time Protestants were not believed to be saved, and in fact you still weren't supposed to marry one of them if you were a Catholic. And there was a lot of separation on the groundswell, and a diffuse change of rocks in some towns around the churches. So it was so sad. Here I am, a little boy of 7 or 8, and quite devout for my age. I made my first communion and so on. and even promised the Lord I would become a priest if I lived to be 21. So I took life fairly seriously, you could. So I was worried about Grandma surviving the Last Judgment, as they say. If she had known what I was thinking, I don't know what she would have done. I think she would have, well, I don't think she would have shot the Pope, but she would have felt like it, I think. So it was such a relief to see in that document some acknowledgement that the grace of God was working in the Protestants and even in the other religions. That was a world-shattering change for the Catholic Church. Not a question of continuity at all, as far as I can see. And it was liberating. And so we began to have relations with them. And as I'd been to non-Catholic schools, I knew that a lot of Protestants and people who even have no religion and Jewish boys were really nice people, just as nice as the Catholics. So that was one of the, as that change dawned on me, it was very powerful and liberating. And many of the other community were very pleased with that and wanted to entertain some spiritual teachers from other traditions. So we had both Protestant and other religious denominations, or I should say religions, like, and we did have a visit from Panikar once or twice, so that others who were able to read the documents and some of the magazines that contained the text and the background of the different decisions. I didn't have time to look at those until really after I stopped being an abbot. It was just, you had to keep abreast of times. Another one of the documents that was very influential was the document that, was it Courtney Murray was responsible for, that speaks of freedom of conscience. Well, this had been always kind of ambiguous for Catholics, I think, because you're supposed to obey the Church, and in some areas you're supposed to give internal obedience, whereas, and that was applied to religious life, the authority of the local superior was supreme, unless you wanted to go to a higher authority. So the hierarchical structure of the Church was a bastion of defensive mechanisms against other doctrinal sayings, and tried to protect Catholics as if they were all children. And they were, I guess, mostly in America in the 40s and 50s. But now they've gone to school in great numbers, and still more after the GI Bill. So these were some very well-educated people. And also the nuns were clamoring for some kind of recognition, or at least the chance to be educated. For years they couldn't expect to be sent to some educational institution. So one of my novices who had been with me some years, he was from a Protestant tradition. I think he was a professor at the University of Massachusetts for some years, and he got converted, I don't know quite how, to the Catholic religion. And he had quite a rigid mentality. He was very orderly minded, and then had become trained in the Christian theology, especially the Neo-Thomists in a big degree. So, and he always liked to win an argument, so it was hard to talk to him. But he said he felt that the council had pulled the rug out from underneath his feet, because all the reasons he had for entering the Church when he was at UMass, ceased to exist. And now you had this openness to other traditions and ideas and rituals. So, but he persevered to the end. He only died a couple of years ago in his early 90s, but he had a sore back all that time. But others were on the very liberal side and were reading some of the background for the council, which was exciting. And you had great teachers. You had Rahner, and you had Chenu, and you had Kung, and so on. And these were influencing, for the first time, the bishops' thinking, because the bishops had no way of getting educated, either having a broad spectrum of ideas to choose from. So the idea of everything changing, and then there were a few nifty spirits who pushed it too far and wanted to change everything in the liturgy. But there was a tremendous force there in the English-speaking world to change to the vernacular. And that meant the unification of monastic communities, so that everybody would join the choir, and you'd have this unified approach. But the brothers had a different vocation, and so this was excruciating for them. They felt rejected by the general chapter. They didn't understand the council at all, and they were not trained at all in theology. So they suffered a great deal from the changes which they thought were destroying their brother's life, and the brother's life was gradually absorbed into although they were able to choose their own schedule with the abbot's permission. But that was a very significant, nobody knew what the consequences would be. So the brothers now had the vote, which they never had. They had the same habit, followed the same schedule. They were unified without wanting to be, and in some cases vigorously not wanting to be. So these changes that came as a result of the opening of the council was devastating for some, and others wanted to go forward, try other experiments. So just to give you one example, we had all the psalms in Latin, and you think of 5 or 6 hours a day chanting psalms. You eventually memorize them all. Well, then all that is thrown out, and you get everything is now in English without the best poetry and so on. So that was very rugged to adjust to, but it was still inspiring to hear the words in Latin. But the thing they forgot to do, and they didn't have experience. They start this thing, so the abbots, it didn't occur to them that if you have this much English in the liturgy, you have to shorten it, cut it down, because you just get tired of all the ideas that are going on and on. So it was very difficult to get the offices shortened. But at the end of the council, permission was given to make experiments. So as a friend of mine who was something of a mystic in the sense of voices from heaven, she said she had a prophetic vision of the chapter, and she said, the abbots are like racehorses at the gate. They're just raring to go. So as soon as the permission for the vernacular happened, everybody went into vernacular. And against Pope Paul's wishes, he wanted the monks to remain in Latin because of the great genius and beauty of Gregorian chant when it was properly sung. That is a real question mark. So we began inviting some of these outstanding people like Swami Satchidananda, and I can't remember all the others we had, but the main one certainly was Rashi Sasaki. I learned so much from this man, just listening to his approach to the metaphysics, you might say, of faith, and his incredible perceptivity of the importance of what the ritual represents. And that's why he came to see us in the first place, because he thought the Americans weren't going to accept any ritual. They didn't like to be regulated more than the Ten Commandments, if them. So he was dealing with people who were gung-ho for the Zen method, but not for discipline. And there were several, there were so many changes going on at once that this was disconcerting. Some way you just get used to one change. But there was so much to do with the changes. You imagine how much work it would be to create in a few weeks or months, or even a year or two, a liturgy that would be as well thought out and compete with the classical Roman liturgy of, 1,500 years or something. So at the same time, the outside world was continuing, and there was a new process emphasizing feeling your emotions. It was originally designed for executives who were kind of stodgy and nobody could talk to them. So these were embraced by some governmental organization called they were tea groups. And you would get in a small group and the leader would guide you as a kind of high priest into the emotional levels. It was good for honesty. So I went to one of them because some in the community thought I could use a little more massage in my relationships. So I must say it was a marvelous experience. It put you in an emotional high that you almost had never been in before, and a great sense of belonging to the other people. And the more they revealed as they sat on the hot seat their weaknesses and what they were feeling, the more everybody loved them. And so it was a whole new insight into community for me, that really what you need to make community is friendship and honesty and deep sharing. Whereas structures, they can try all day and they don't produce that kind of sense of community and concern for others that is hard to integrate with ideals of solitude and silence at the same time. So nobody knew how to do this. So I guess there was great dialogue. We got into dialogue in a big way, and some of the communities started, but they had never been taught how to speak to each other, especially in a group. So it was a disaster, and some communities just stopped dialoguing. But we plowed ahead for about 2 years, and the community decided on all the experiments. Like one of them was private rooms. Up till that time, we all lived in a dormitory, and the diet was moderated in some degree, but some of the offices were shortened a bit. But we still had this. One of the biggest changes in a monastery like this that might not be of interest to most of you, but it was a huge change, is instead of all the priests saying a private mass, there was just one mass, and all the priests shared and got credit for saying mass without doing a thing except standing there. So it was hard on some of the older priests to really adjust to that. But it did provide more time to do other things. Meanwhile, our work situation required us to work long hours in the morning in an industry to making jelly, which is not exactly the most devout occupation, but you had to earn a living. That was one of our principles, was to try to earn your own living, but it meant the industrialization of the monastic milieu, which is a huge difference that Benedict never foresaw. I think Benedict suggested a balance between public prayer, a community prayer together and silent, and then Lectio Divina, which is a kind of a meditative reading, especially of Scripture, and work. And the work of manual labor in the garden and raising animals and so on was much more exposed to nature, and hence the shift of the attentions or the energies of the brain, so that you could recover from hours of singing psalms or offices and so on. So you can see from this brief survey that almost every aspect of our life was significantly modified or changed, so that you could hardly recognize what it had been when we came in. One of the major changes was to ease the rule of silence, so that you couldn't speak to anybody without permission of the abbot. So some houses designated certain places of silence, so it was somewhat preserved, but it was nothing like what I went through in the first 7 years of my monastic life, where the silence was absolute, and if you didn't keep it, you got proclaimed in a chapter of faults, humiliated in front of everybody. So it was a deterrent. But it seems to me it injured the work of love, unless you were just out to be humiliated. But meanwhile, some of the other documents were gaining force, and I think I've mentioned the chief changes that enabled our community to be open, at least without fighting it, so to speak, this process. But as the time passed over Vatican II, other decisions came on, and it became clear that some of the early council fathers had hesitations about the extent of the changes here and there. We had a visit from Cardinal Suenens, who was a very strong charismatic, and that's another push from the Holy Spirit that arose out of nowhere that we had expected. Namely, the Catholics became very interested in the charismatic renewal that was present in some of the evangelical groups in a big way. And they wanted a charismatic prayer, and that movement has now moved to South America, where I think a large proportion of Catholics are committed to ecumenical worship, and are not attracted anymore to some of the more classical rituals of their tradition. At the end of Vatican II, we were invited specifically to look at all our rules and regulations as each religious community, with a view to renewing the spirit of the founders, and above all, returning to the gospel as the basic principle. So this was a wonderful principle, but extremely hard to put into action, and is still going on. But for the abbot, I would say, a conscientious abbot at least, it was a kind of crucifixion, because the community had these permissions, so you couldn't exactly deny them without getting into serious trouble, I would say, with the community. And so you didn't know what to do, and so you didn't have time to give it thought and prayer, because everybody wanted to move ahead. They'd been held back for so long, and now that it's possible, they really were like, not only the abbots, but everybody else is like horse races. Try all the experiments and some did better than others, and then the vocations did start to diminish. But a lot of good things came in with that. There was a more mature view of how to evaluate candidates, and the time was, the different specifics were carefully thought out, and the parameters of the new experiments, some of those were set. So it started out in utter chaos, and gradually, with help of some of the abbots, it began to have a certain order to it. And then we had to deal with the nuns in the order who wanted to be united to us, and that's still going on, and seems to have been a real improvement. So what the Vatican II has done, it seems to me, and I speak mostly from religious life, monastic life, because in my experience, the tensions that occur in the church and society are reflected and magnified in a religious community that's separate from the world and is living a certain amount of silence, so that you feel the difficulties more. You don't have the distractions of daily work and the children running around and education and trying to further your career. You've got other interests, but in an enclosed monastery, you're just face to face with the problems day after day, and if there are conflicts in the community, it becomes a very difficult place to live, and almost anyone would think there must be a better way of doing this, and they will leave. And some of our best people, I think, moved on during the period after Vatican II, after some years.